In the small village of Amagu, Mrs. Ada lived a simple life with her only daughter, Emma. Emma, a 12-year-old girl, was known throughout the village for her beauty, which matched the meaning of her name, beauty itself. Her delicate features, bright eyes, and graceful demeanor made her stand out, but despite their humble life, she never showed off. She was kind, respectful, and always by her mother's side. The villagers often saw the mother and daughter duo working on different farmlands. They didn't own any land of their own, but they were always willing to help others. In return, they received enough food and a small amount of money to survive. It wasn't much, but it was enough for them to get by. Despite their poverty, they were content, and their bond made their life feel richer than it seemed. Emma admired her mother more than anyone else in the world. Mrs. Ada was a hard-working woman, and even though they didn't have much, she always found a way to take care of her daughter. Every day, after their work in the fields, they would return to their small hut and share a simple meal. Sometimes it was just yam and palm oil, but Emma never complained. She was grateful for every meal because she knew how hard her mother worked. Even at such a young age, Emma had taken on a lot of responsibility. She helped her mother with every task, whether it was working in the fields, fetching water, or preparing their meals. She didn't have the luxury of playing with the other children, but she didn't mind. Her mother's health and happiness were more important to her than anything else. One evening, after a long day of work, Mrs. Ada complained of feeling unusually tired. At first, Emma thought it was just the exhaustion from working in the sun all day, but as the days passed, her mother's condition worsened. She began to cough frequently, and her once strong body seemed to grow weaker by the day. Emma grew increasingly worried. She had never seen her mother so sick before. Mrs. Ada, who had always been a pillar of strength, now struggled to even stand. Emma tried her best to take care of her, preparing herbal teas and fetching water from the nearby stream. But nothing seemed to work. Her mother's health continued to deteriorate, and Ma felt helpless. Desperate to find a cure, Emma began visiting the village's medicine women. She asked them for advice and bought various herbs with the little money they had saved. Every day she would go into the bush to gather leaves and roots, hoping to find something that would make her mother better. When she wasn't in the bush, she was in the market, asking traders for herbal medicines. Despite her best efforts, nothing seemed to help. Emma tried everything she could find, but Mrs. Ada's condition only grew worse. Emma was filled with fear. She couldn't imagine a life without her mother, and the thought of losing her sent waves of panic through her heart. But she didn't give up. She knew she had to keep trying, no matter how hopeless it seemed. One afternoon, after another failed attempt to improve her mother's health, Emma walked home from the forest, tears streaming down her face. As she hurried through the village, a woman she didn't know stopped her. The woman, noticing Ma's distress, asked why she was crying. At first, Ma hesitated to answer, but the woman's kind eyes gave her a sense of comfort. Ma explained her mother's illness and how she had tried everything to help her, but nothing worked. The woman listened carefully and then told Emma about a powerful chief priest who lived in a neighboring village called Ovoko. According to the woman, the priest had healed many people who were near death, and he might be able to help Mrs. Ada, too. Emma's heart filled with hope at the stranger's words. This was the first time she had heard of the priest, but she knew she had to try. If there was even the smallest chance that he could save her mother, she had to take it. Without wasting any time, she thanked the woman and ran home to tell her mother about the priest. Mrs. Ada was too weak to speak, but Emma could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. She knew her mother was scared of what might happen, and so was she. But Emma pushed those feelings aside. She couldn't afford to be scared now. She had to be strong for her mother. After gathering a few things, she helped Mrs. Ada into a small cart borrowed from a neighbor, and they began the long journey to Ovoko. The journey to Ovoko was exhausting. Emma had to pull the cart herself, and the road was rough and uneven. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not when her mother's life was at stake. When they finally arrived in Ovoko, it was already evening and the village was quiet. Emma asked around until someone pointed her to the chief priest's shrine. The shrine was large and intimidating, with strange carvings and symbols on the walls. Emma felt a shiver of fear run down her spine as she approached the priest. He was an old man with a stern face, but there was something powerful about him. When Emma explained her mother's condition, the priest listened silently, then told her that he could heal Mrs. Ada, but it would come at a cost. The priest explained that the healing would require a large amount of money for the necessary rituals and medicines. Emma's heart sank. She didn't have any money, and she knew there was no way she could get that much, even if she worked for years. But the priest wasn't finished. There was another option, he said. If Emma couldn't pay with money, she could agree to serve him for 5 years. During that time, she would have to do whatever he asked of her, no matter what. Emma was horrified by the offer. The thought of staying with the priest for 5 years, away from her mother and the life she knew, terrified her. But what choice did she have? Her mother's life was in danger, and this was the only way to save her. With tears in her eyes, Emma agreed to the deal, praying that her sacrifice would be worth it. The next morning, the priest began the treatment. He performed rituals and gave Mrs. Ada strange herbs to drink. At first, Emma was skeptical, but after a few days, her mother began to show signs of improvement. Her cough lessened, and she could sit up for the first time in weeks. Emma's heart filled with relief. It seemed the priest's magic was working. However, Mrs. Ada was still too weak to leave the shrine, so Emma stayed by her side, caring for her day and night. The priest had been kind enough to allow her to sleep in a small hut nearby, and Emma was grateful for that. Each day, her mother grew stronger, and Emma began to believe that everything would be all right. As Mrs. Ada's health improved, she began to ask Emma more and more questions. She wanted to know how they had come to Ovoko, who the priest was, and what had been done to cure her. Emma always gave the same answer. "Don't worry, Mama. Just focus on getting better." She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother about the agreement she had made with the priest. She didn't want to burden her with that knowledge, not when she was still recovering. But Mrs. Ada wasn't satisfied. She could sense that something wasn't right, and her motherly instincts told her that Emma was hiding something. Each time Emma avoided her questions, Mrs. Ada's concern grew. After much pressure, Emma finally revealed the heartbreaking truth to her mother about the agreement she had made with the chief priest. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, and her voice broke with guilt and sorrow. Mrs. Ada, already weak from her illness, was devastated by the news. She held Emma tightly, weeping uncontrollably, and scolded her daughter for accepting such a harsh and painful bargain. Emma cried alongside her, apologizing and explaining that she had only wanted to save her mother's life, no matter the cost. Mrs. Ada was unable to find peace that night, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her heart. She sobbed quietly until, exhausted from grief, she eventually fell into a restless sleep, her mind troubled by the difficult reality her daughter had faced alone. In the morning, after Emma had completed her morning chores, she decided to visit the market to buy some food. Before leaving, she checked on her mother, who was still sleeping peacefully. Emma didn't want to wake her, so she quietly left the hut and promised herself she would be back soon. 3 hours later, Emma returned with food, eager to check on her mother. When she entered the hut, Mrs. Ada was still in bed, exactly as Emma had left her, but something was wrong. Emma called out to her mother, but there was no response. Her heart raced as she rushed to the bed and touched her mother's hand. It was cold. Panic set in as Emma shook her mother, calling her name over and over, but it was too late. Mrs. Ada was gone. Emma's world shattered in that moment. The woman who had been her entire world, the one person she had fought so hard to save, was gone. Emma collapsed next to the bed, her cries echoing through the shrine. That same night, Mrs. Ada was buried in the shrine's forest. According to the village's customs, anyone who died at the shrine had to be buried in the shrine's forest, far away from their home. Emma was devastated. She couldn't believe that her mother was gone. She hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye. The burial was a small and solemn affair, attended only by the chief priest, his servants, and Emma. As they laid Mrs. Ada to rest, Emma's heart felt like it was being torn apart. The forest, dark and silent, seemed to swallow her mother whole, and Emma stood there numb with grief. After the burial, Emma returned to the hut she shared with her mother, but now it felt cold and empty. The one person who had always been there for her was gone, and she had no one left to turn to. She curled up in the corner of the hut, crying until there were no more tears left to shed. Her mother's death felt like the end of her world. 3 days after the burial, Emma went to the chief priest to ask for permission to return to her village. She wanted to leave the shrine and go back to the life she knew, even if it meant being alone. But the chief priest refused. He reminded Emma of the agreement she had made before her mother's treatment, that she would serve him for 5 years. Emma was shocked. She had hoped that the priest would show some compassion after her mother's death, but he was firm in his decision. The agreement had been made, and there was no going back. Emma had no choice but to stay. She had no money, no family, and nowhere else to go. The priest's word was law in this part of the land, and there was no one to fight for her. Emma's life at the shrine became one of routine and servitude. Every morning she woke up before dawn to sweep the compound, fetch water, and prepare food for the priest and the 3 boys who served him. The boys were older than Emma, and they had been with the priest for years, serving him without question. They didn't speak much to Emma, and she felt isolated and alone in their presence. The priest treated Emma well enough, giving her food and shelter, but there was always an unspoken tension in the air. Emma was trapped in this life, bound by the agreement she had made in desperation to save her mother. The days were long and hard, and Emma found herself thinking about her mother constantly. The grief weighed heavily on her, and she often went to the forest where her mother was buried to cry and talk to her in silence. One night, as Emma lay in her small hut, she woke up to the sound of footsteps. Her heart raced as the door opened, and the chief priest walked in. Emma felt scared but didn't know what to do. He came closer, and she felt a sense of fear as he crossed boundaries that made her uncomfortable. Emma didn't know who to turn to or how to speak up. The priest was powerful, and she was just a servant. Emma felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The shame and guilt consumed her, and she blamed herself for everything. She felt dirty, unworthy of kindness or love. She was just a servant, a tool for the priest to use whenever he wanted. Emma couldn't tell anyone about what was happening to her. Who would believe her? The priest was a powerful man, and she was just a poor, orphaned girl. The boys who served the priest were always around, but they never spoke to her or asked her how she was. They seemed to live in their own world, disconnected from the pain and suffering that Emma was going through. Each day, Emma went through the motions of her chores, trying to push the memories of the night away. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the priest's grasp. She felt trapped, both physically and emotionally, and the weight of her silence grew heavier with each passing day. As months passed, Emma's once lean body began to change. Her belly started to swell, and her strength weakened. It wasn't long before she realized that she was pregnant with the priest's child. The thought made her sick to her stomach. How could this have happened to her? She was just a child herself, and now she was carrying the child of a man who had taken advantage of her. Emma's pregnancy became impossible to hide. The boys who served the priest noticed, and whispers began to circulate around the shrine. People in the village started to talk, wondering who the father could be, but Emma remained silent. She couldn't bear to speak the truth, and even if she did, who would listen? Who would care? Emma's only solace came when she was able to leave the shrine and go to the village square. She would sit there for hours, watching the birds and listening to the sounds of the village. It was the only place where she could feel a semblance of peace, far away from the horrors of the shrine. Sometimes, Emma would walk all the way back to her home village, even though it was a long journey. She would visit her mother's old hut, now abandoned, and cry her heart out. It was the only place where she felt connected to her mother, and in those moments, she allowed herself to grieve. One day, while Emma was sitting at the village square, a group of girls from the neighboring village spotted her. They began to mock her, pointing at her swollen belly and calling her names. Emma tried to ignore them, but the words cut deep. She had always been the quiet, kind girl that everyone respected, and now she was a target of ridicule. The girls threw sand at her, and she curled up in a ball, trying to shield herself from their cruelty. As the girls continued, the Igwe, the king of Ovoko, passed by with his guards. He saw the scene unfolding and immediately ordered the girls to stop. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice stern and commanding. The girls scattered in fear, leaving Emma lying on the ground crying. The Igwe approached her, his expression softening when he saw her condition. He ordered his guards to help Emma up and asked his bodyguard if they knew who she was. The bodyguard admitted that they had never seen her before. The Igwe, concerned for the young girl, decided to take Emma back to his palace to learn more about her situation. At the palace, Emma was treated with kindness and care, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. The Igwe's wife, the queen, offered her warm food and a comfortable place to rest. When Emma felt ready, she told the Igwe everything about her mother's illness, the deal with the priest, and the terrible things that had happened to her at the shrine. The Igwe listened in shock and anger. He couldn't believe that such cruelty had been inflicted on such a young girl. He sent for the chief priest immediately, demanding an explanation. The priest, of course, defended himself, saying that Emma had agreed to serve him for 5 years, and that the child she carried was a consequence of that agreement. After much deliberation, the Igwe made a decision that would change Emma's life forever. He refused to let her return to the shrine and declared that she would stay at the palace as long as she needed. The priest protested, but the Igwe's word was final. Emma was now under the protection of the royal family, and she would no longer have to suffer under the priest's control. Life at the palace was vastly different from anything Emma had known. She was treated with respect, given fine clothes, and allowed to rest. The queen, who had always longed for a daughter, took Emma under her wing and treated her like her own child. For the first time in a long while, Ma felt safe. The Igwe and queen had only one son, a 16-year-old boy named Chinedu. He was kind and gentle, and he welcomed Emma into the palace with open arms. Though Emma was shy at first, the two quickly became friends. Chinedu treated her like a sister, and they often spent their afternoons together in the palace gardens, talking and laughing. Chinedu's kindness helped Emma heal from the trauma she had experienced. Though the memories of the shrine still haunted her, she began to feel hope for the future. She wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a home. Months passed and Emma's pregnancy progressed. The palace staff and villagers had grown fond of Emma, and they eagerly awaited the arrival of her baby. Despite the difficult circumstances under which Emma had become pregnant, she was treated with care and love by the queen and the palace staff. As her due date approached, Emma's anxiety about giving birth increased. She was terrified of the pain and the uncertainty of what would happen afterward, but the queen reassured her every step of the way. Finally, the day arrived. After hours of labor, Emma gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The queen was by her side the entire time, holding her hand and comforting her through the ordeal. When the baby was born, the queen looked at him and smiled. "We will call him Ugo," she said, naming him after the royal bird, a symbol of honor and dignity. For Emma, the birth of Ugo was bittersweet. She loved her child deeply, but the circumstances surrounding his conception still weighed heavily on her. Yet when she looked into Ugo's innocent eyes, she knew that he was not to blame for any of it. He was a symbol of her resilience, her strength to endure, and her ability to rise above the pain. Raising Ugo became Emma's full-time focus. The queen, who had become like a mother to Emma, helped her care for him, ensuring that both Emma and Ugo were well taken care of. Emma poured all of her love into her son. Every smile he gave her, every little coo or giggle, brought her joy. Despite the hardships she had endured, Ugo was her light, her reason to keep going. Ugo quickly became the darling of the palace. The Igwe adored him, and even Chinedu, the young prince, treated him like a little brother. Emma was deeply grateful for the love and support that surrounded her, but she couldn't shake the fear that one day the truth about Ugo's father would come to light. It had been 10 years since Prince Chinedu and Emma first met. Their bond had grown stronger with time. Now, as adults, their friendship was still deep, though their lives were filled with more responsibilities. Chinedu was preparing to take over from his father as king, and Emma had her own challenges, taking care of Ugo. They both see each other as siblings. One afternoon, Emma told Prince Chinedu she wanted to visit the village stream, a place where they had spent countless hours as children. The stream held memories of their carefree days, and Emma longed to return, even if just for a short while. Chinedu agreed, always willing to indulge Emma's wishes. As they walked through the forest towards the stream, they laughed and talked about their childhood adventures. When they arrived at the stream, they sat by the water, watching it flow peacefully. It felt like they had stepped back in time, away from the burdens of their adult lives. But the tranquility of the moment wouldn't last long. Emma stood up to dip her feet in the water, unaware that danger was lurking nearby. Chinedu suddenly noticed something moving near her feet, a snake coiling dangerously close to her. Fear shot through Chinedu as he saw the snake slithering closer to Emma's leg. He yelled a warning, but Emma, startled and frightened, panicked. Without thinking, she leaped into the water, trying to escape the snake. But Emma didn't know how to swim. In her fear, she plunged into the deep part of the stream and immediately began to struggle, her arms flailing as she gasped for air. Chinedu, acting on instinct, grabbed a stick and quickly killed the snake. But when he turned back to Emma, his heart dropped. She was sinking beneath the water. Without a second thought, Chinedu dived into the stream, swimming frantically toward Emma. He reached her just in time, pulling her unconscious body out of the water. The prince dragged her to the shore, his heart racing with fear and adrenaline. Emma wasn't breathing. Prince Chinedu's heart pounded as he laid Emma on the grass. Her body was still, her chest unmoving. Tears filled his eyes as he called her name, desperately shaking her. She didn't respond. In that moment, Chinedu felt fear like he had never known before. He couldn't lose Emma. She had always been a part of his life, and the thought of her being gone was unbearable. With shaking hands, he leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers, attempting to revive her. He breathed into her, praying that she would wake up. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then suddenly Emma's body jerked. She coughed, water pouring from her mouth, and gasped for air. Her eyes fluttered open and she stared up at Chinedu, confused and disoriented. Relief washed over Prince Chinedu as Emma's eyes focused on him. Tears streamed down his face as he realized she was alive. In a moment of pure emotion, without thinking, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but one of overwhelming relief and gratitude. Emma, still dazed, kissed him back. The kiss was long, filled with the unspoken bond that had always been between them. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their hearts racing. Something had shifted between them, something neither of them could explain. It wasn't just the friendship they had known all their lives. There was something more now, something deeper. They stared at each other, unsure of what to say, the moment too intense for words. After the incident at the stream, things changed between Emma and Prince Chinedu. They had always been close, but now there was a new tension between them, one that neither could ignore. They found themselves thinking about each other constantly. Emma, who had always been comfortable around Chinedu, now found herself nervous in his presence. Her heart would skip a beat whenever she saw him, and she often avoided him, unsure of how to handle her new feelings. The prince was no different. He couldn't get the memory of the kiss out of his mind. It haunted him, filling his thoughts day and night. He had always cared for Emma, but now his feelings had grown into something he didn't fully understand. He longed to be near her, to hold her again, but he didn't know if she felt the same way. One evening, after weeks of tension, Prince Chinedu could no longer hold back his feelings. He sought out Emma, finding her sitting alone in her hut, staring out at the stars. The air was cool and the night was quiet, but inside, Chinedu's heart was racing. He knew that once he spoke, nothing would be the same. "Emma," he said softly, sitting beside her. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "I can't stop thinking about you, about that day at the stream, about everything." Emma's heart raced as she listened to him. She had been avoiding these feelings for weeks, unsure of what they meant. But hearing Chinedu say the words she had been too afraid to voice made something inside her shift. She looked into his eyes and for the first time allowed herself to admit what she had been feeling all along. That night, Emma and Prince Chinedu confessed their love for each other. It was a moment of honesty and vulnerability, one that neither of them had expected but both had longed for. They kissed again, this time with the full knowledge that this was the beginning of something real, something that would change their lives forever. But as happy as they were, they knew their love wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time they were ready to face them, together. Despite their happiness, Emma and Chinedu's relationship remained a secret for weeks. They knew the king would disapprove, but they couldn't bring themselves to part. They met in secret, stealing moments together whenever they could. But secrets never stay hidden for long. One day, word reached the king about his son's relationship with Emma. Furious, the king summoned Chinedu and demanded to know the truth. When Chinedu confessed his love for Emma, the king's anger boiled over. He forbade the relationship, insisting that Chinedu marry a noblewoman, not a village girl like Emma. The king's anger wasn't just directed at his son, he also blamed Emma. In his eyes, she had taken advantage of their family's kindness. In a fit of rage, he ordered Emma to leave the palace immediately. Emma, heartbroken and devastated, had no choice but to obey. She packed her few belongings and, with tears streaming down her face, left the palace that had been her home for so many years with her son. Emma returned to her mother's old hut, far from the luxury and safety of the palace. Life in the village was hard, but what hurt the most was being separated from Prince Chinadu. They had only just begun their love story, and now it seemed as though it might be over before it had even started. Life in the village was a harsh adjustment for Emma. She had lived in the palace for years, surrounded by luxury and comfort, but now she found herself in her mother's old hut, struggling to make ends meet. The small home was in disrepair, and Emma and her young son Ugo had to make do with very little. They had no servants, no fine clothes, and no abundance of food. Every day was a battle to survive. Despite her struggles, Emma kept going, not for herself, but for her son. Ugo was too young to understand the full weight of their situation, but he sensed the sadness in his mother's eyes. Emma worked tirelessly to provide for him, but the absence of Prince Chinedu weighed heavily on her heart. She missed him every moment, wondering if he thought of her too. Prince Chinedu couldn't stay away. Though his father had forbidden their relationship, Chinedu found himself sneaking away from the palace to visit Emma and Ugo. He couldn't bear the thought of them struggling alone. Every few days, he would bring food, clothes, and small gifts for Ugo, who adored his visits. The boy always ran to Chinedu with a smile, not knowing the pain and tension between the prince and his mother. Each visit was bittersweet. Emma and Chinedu longed to be together, but they were painfully aware of the reality that stood between them. Emma tried to keep her distance, knowing that their relationship was impossible under the king's rule. But each time she saw Chinedu's face, the love in her heart grew stronger. Back at the palace, life wasn't the same since Emma and Ugo left. Though the king's pride kept him from admitting it, the absence of the boy weighed heavily on his heart. Ugo had become like a grandson to him, and the palace felt emptier without the child's laughter echoing through the halls. The queen, too, missed Emma dearly. She had always considered her a daughter, and the loss of her presence left a hole in the queen's heart. The servants whispered about the change in the palace's atmosphere. Once a place of joy and life, it now felt cold and lifeless. The queen, unable to bear it any longer, began to plead with the king to reconsider his decision. She reminded him of the bond between Chinedu and Emma, how their love was pure and true. But the king remained silent, his face set in stone, unwilling to admit he might have made a mistake. Ugo, though young, had an effect on everyone around him. His joyful spirit and innocent heart had made him a beloved figure at the palace, and his absence was felt deeply. The king often found himself thinking about the boy, wondering if he was safe and well cared for in the village. He missed the way Ugo would sit by his side, asking questions and sharing his childish thoughts. One evening, as the king sat alone in his chambers, he found himself reminiscing about the times Ugo had made him smile. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he been too harsh? Was his pride worth the loss of a child he had grown to care for as his own? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside, still unwilling to bend to his emotions. The queen, unlike the king, was not so stubborn. She couldn't stand seeing her son, Chinedu, in such pain, and she missed Emma and Ugo with all her heart. She decided to take matters into her own hands. One night, as the king sat at dinner, she approached him with a determined look in her eyes. "My king," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I can't bear this any longer. The palace is not the same without them. Ugo is like a grandson to us, and Emma, she is part of our family. You must allow them to come back." The king looked at her, his face hard, but inside, her words stirred something deep within him. He didn't respond right away, but the queen continued. "Our son loves her, and she loves him. They have faced so much together. Can't you see how much they mean to each other? Please, let them return." The king sat in silence for a long time after the queen's plea. He stared down at his hands, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He loved his son and wanted the best for him, but he had always envisioned Chinedu marrying someone of noble blood. Emma, despite her kindness and loyalty, was not the wife he had planned for the future king. But the palace had grown cold without them. The king missed Ugo more than he was willing to admit, and he saw the pain in his son's eyes every day. Slowly, the walls of his pride began to crack. That night, the king lay awake, thinking about everything the queen had said. In the morning, he made his decision. He would allow Emma and Ugo to return to the palace. The next morning, the king summoned Chinedu to his chambers. The prince, still heartbroken over being separated from Emma, entered the room with a heavy heart, expecting another argument. But instead his father looked at him with a softer expression than usual. "Chinedu," the king began, "I have thought about your love for Emma and Ugo's place in this family. I have decided they may return to the palace." Chinedu's heart leapt with joy. He could hardly believe his ears. For weeks he had feared that his father would never accept his love for Emma. But now, there was hope. Without wasting another moment, Chinedu hurried to the village to deliver the good news. When Chinedu arrived at Emma's hut, she was sitting outside with Ugo, their faces tired but still filled with hope. The sight of Chinedu approaching filled Ma's heart with a mix of emotions, love, longing, and uncertainty. As he reached her, he smiled, his eyes shining with excitement. "Mama," he said, "my father has asked for you and Ugo to return to the palace." Ma stared at him in disbelief. After all the pain and separation, it was hard to believe that the king had finally relented. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced Chinedu, overwhelmed by the news. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. Their love had survived, and now they could be together once more. The journey back to the palace was filled with excitement and nerves. Emma wasn't sure how she would be received after everything that had happened, but Chinedu reassured her that things would be different now. As they approached the palace gates, Ugo ran ahead, eager to see the place he had once called home. When they arrived, the queen greeted them with open arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. She hugged Emma tightly, whispering words of comfort and welcome. Ugo, full of excitement, ran straight to the king, who was waiting in the grand hall. The king smiled, a rare, genuine smile, as Ugo climbed into his lap, laughing and chattering away. Though the king said little, the warmth in his eyes showed that he was glad to have them back. With Emma and Ugo back in the palace, life began to feel normal again. The halls were once again filled with laughter and warmth. Emma, though still cautious around the king, felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. She was no longer just a village girl. She was part of something bigger, something stronger. As for Chinedu, his heart was full. He and Emma could finally be together without hiding, without fear of being torn apart. The love they had fought so hard for was now accepted, and they looked forward to building a future together. Their journey hadn't been easy, but they had proven that love, when true, can overcome any obstacle. It wasn't long before Chinedu made his intentions clear. He wanted to marry Emma, though the king had allowed her to return to the palace. The idea of marriage still hung in the air like an unanswered question. One evening, during a family gathering, Chinedu stood before his father and formally asked for his blessing to marry Emma. The room fell silent as the king considered his son's request. For a moment it seemed as though he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "If this is what you truly want, Chinedu," the king said, "then you have my blessing." Chinedu and Emma exchanged a look of pure joy. The announcement of Chinedu and Emma's engagement spread quickly throughout the village and the palace. Though some of the nobles whispered in disapproval, most of the villagers were thrilled. Emma had always been beloved by the people, and they were excited to see her as their future queen. The wedding ceremony was a beautiful and emotional affair. The entire village had gathered to witness the momentous occasion, and the joy was palpable. As Chinedu and Emma exchanged their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Their love had overcome so many obstacles, and now they stood united, ready to face whatever the future held. After the ceremony, the celebrations began. The villagers danced and sang, filling the palace grounds with life and laughter. Feasts were laid out in abundance, and everyone, nobles and commoners alike, joined in the festivities. It was a day of unity, where the barriers between classes seemed to disappear, if only for a moment. Emma and Chinedu, hand in hand, moved through the crowd, greeting their guests and sharing in the joy of the day. Though the journey to this moment had been difficult, they knew that together they could face anything. They had built their love on a foundation of trust, respect, and resilience. and now they would build their future on that same foundation.